potentially. How did you know, and how would another person know if they actually are suffering from burnout? Because some people are suffering and they just keep going
Yeah, absolutely. And I felt
to their
like I
detriment.
was like that. So my health was becoming not great, which ended up in
Well, what do you
me.
mean? You were
So
sick?
was started getting like a lot of colds, and even to just like look at myself, like my skin looked bad and I've never had those kind of issues. I felt like I had permanent jet lag. And the worst bit was that when I would go to sleep, I couldn't sleep because my mind was just swirling with all the work and things that I had to do. And so it was like one day to the next, I just felt so depleted. And then it was this feeling of complete apathy where I didn't care about anything anymore. And it's interesting when you talk about emotions, they actually say that that emotion is kind of worse than being angry or, sad, because then it's an actual emotion that you have this strong feeling towards. But apathy is like you stop caring, right? You stop caring, you stop enjoying. Like I remember everything became hard, even my kids, who I love dearly. It became hard looking after them. Like nothing was fun, nothing was exciting to me anymore. I was so tired, and all I could think about was work 24/7. And that moment where I got a really bad case of the flu, this is the pre-COVID times, and I could barely walk to the couch. I remember, as I said, in that moment, just thinking, I can't do this anymore. It was a light bulb moment, but also one of the worst moments of my life, where I thought, I just can't go on like this. I need to make a change in my life. And I did.
But did you look at it like, did you think to yourself, this is a failure? Did you, and if so, did you have to struggle with what is failure as opposed to am I being successful by actually recognizing it?
Yeah, that's right. That's a great question. I think at the time, I probably did feel like it was some sort of failure because, as I mentioned, I always wanted to achieve that. I always wanted to be this, I wanted to do a lot of acting and things like that when I was young, but I wanted this show to work, and I wanted to be the best producer I could. And I thought that I had built something that would allow me to do that. And what I realized is that I was completely crumbling inside. So I 100% felt like I had failed. And yet at the same time, I also was still too scared to let go of that job,
Why?
because I was scared to go into the unknown, and I was scared that I was at the best show that I could be on for radio at the time, and I wouldn't maybe get another job anywhere else. And it was very safe for me. You see, going into the unknown is scary for majority of people, and it's something at that time, and even now still, when I know all about the unknown and how a lot of potential comes from going into places that we fear. For me, that was scary. So you know what happened? This is quite a funny in hindsight story. I didn't want to leave that job, even though I hated it and I felt so unwell and all that kind of stuff. So when I had that dark night of the soul moment when I was very unwell, the decision that I made was, I want to understand the mind-body connection. I want to understand why some people are happier than others. I had a friend that was doing a lot of personal development work, and so I went and dived into every personal development book, anything on psychology that I could study, because I wanted to understand how I could change the way that I was thinking. One thing about me, if I do something, I go all in, right? I don't just like read a book or listen to a podcast and sure, I understand it, but make no changes in my life. I'm that sort of person where I make a decision to do something, I'm going to do it. And I thought to myself, I need to change my behaviors and my habits because they have led me to this point of burnout.
For example?
For example, I had a mind that was running wild, right? There's a beautiful Sufi poet from, the 19th century called Rumi, and he has this saying, which was my mind. It says, why do you put yourself in jail when the door is wide open? And that is talking about the mind, where the way that we are thinking is how we perceive things on the outside, right? We can change that in a second. And for me, I had grown up in a family who was so loving and beautiful, but they were worried about everything, right? So it was like, worried about me driving at nighttime, worried that I was too cold, worried that I was too hot, whatever it was. So I grew up with this understanding of worrying. So I would worry about everything. I would constantly worry about my job. I would worry about things that hadn't happened. Say, for example, I'd get an email from someone that I worked with that might have been more superior to me. And it would be like something like, I want to see you tomorrow to discuss a project we're working on. I wouldn't be able to sleep that night. And then I would drive to work thinking that I was probably going to get fired or some other negative thing, right? And this was all because an email said, I want to meet you tomorrow to discuss a project. So my mind was so wired, Mark, towards the negative rather than the positive. That was just my way of coping, but it was driving me mad and it was making me sick, right? Everything I would worry about, even the smallest things, right? Oh my God, my kids are going to this excursion today. Will they be okay? The worst case scenario always playing in my head. It was a safety mechanism. And then the more I studied the mind-body connection, the more I realized, hold on, the way that I think is my choice, not someone else's. I have the ability to change the way that I think. And we know now through neuroscience and neuroplasticity that the mind can rewire itself to the day that you die. You just need to know how to use it properly. So I started to learn about how do we do that? When we get negative thoughts, how do we get rid of them and replace them with a positive feeling thought? What happens when we're ruminating? How do we get out of the cycle of having this negative thought when it's 3:30 a.m. and not being able to sleep? And the more I studied that and the more I learnt about it and how to undo that, the more that I was free. And it wasn't free from any person. It was free from myself, right? And it was the most liberating thing that I've ever experienced. And so going back to the story about what happened is the only thing I was still scared of was moving out of that role, right? So I was holding on to dear life to a role, which sounds so crazy. Even now when I'm telling this story, I'm like, why would I have done that? That I did not like, but it was security for me. I was getting paid a lot of money. And then the boss came from Sydney to Melbourne and he said, your role is moving to Sydney. So do you want to move to Sydney? And I'm like, I can't move to Sydney. Like my whole family's in Melbourne and it's just not going to happen. And it was interesting because I'd been maybe 2 months or so on this studying the mind and learning about psychology and all these other different, bits and pieces.
Mindset stuff.
Exactly. And I would have normally have freaked in a situation like that. But for some reason, I felt okay. And I reckon it was 1.5, 2 weeks later when I got a call from Dave Cameron and Todders saying, hey, we're just started podcast 1 and Hamish and Andy are moving from radio into podcasting. Do you want to be their executive producer? And I was like, oh my God, of course I do. And like I said, 3 months into being their EP, I came up with the idea for my podcast because I could not believe these changes in my life that were happening when I started to change the way that I viewed the world and the way that I thought about myself.